I was 12 when my father taught me that love was something you could lose without warning. He left on a Tuesday morning while I was getting ready for school, his coffee still warm on the kitchen counter, his keys missing from the hook by the door. No goodbye, no explanation, just the sound of our front door closing for the last time and my mother's muffled sobs echoing through our empty house. "Daddy had to go away, Victoria," my mother explained that evening, her voice carefully controlled in the way that meant she was barely holding herself together. Sometimes people can't handle responsibility. Sometimes they just leave. But I heard what she didn't say. Sometimes people leave because you're not worth staying for. My mother rebuilt our life with the precision of someone determined never to be vulnerable again. She worked double shifts at the hospital, earned her nursing degree through night school, and raised me with love that felt like a performance review. Every A+ was rewarded with genuine warmth. Every disappointment was met with that particular silence that meant I'd failed to earn my place in her affection. "You have to be better than perfect, Victoria," she'd say while reviewing my report cards. "The world doesn't give second chances to people like us. You can't afford to be ordinary." By the time I reached Columbia Law School at 24, I'd internalized this lesson completely. I was the student who never missed class, never turned in late assignments, never let professors see anything less than absolute competence. But underneath all that achievement was a wound that never healed, the desperate need to be chosen by someone who would never leave. I thought being chosen by someone magnificent would heal the wound of being abandoned by someone ordinary. I didn't realize I was trading one form of rejection for a more sophisticated kind of erasure. The law review party was held in Professor Hartwell's penthouse apartment, the kind of gathering where future Supreme Court clerks networked over expensive wine and discussed constitutional theory like it was gossip. I stood near the window overlooking Central Park, nursing a glass of champagne and trying to look like I belonged among the trust fund kids and legacy admissions who moved through these spaces with inherited confidence. That's when Adrian Blackwell walked into my life like he owned it. He was beautiful in that effortless way that some people are born with. 6 feet of architectural perfection wrapped in a perfectly tailored suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Sandy brown hair that looked like he'd just run his fingers through it, eyes the color of storm clouds, and a smile that made you feel like you were the only person in the room worth his attention. "Victoria Sterling, right?" He appeared beside me with 2 glasses of wine, offering one with the casual confidence of someone who'd never been turned down. "I've seen your work in Professor Chen's Constitutional Law Seminar. Your analysis of the Commerce Clause was brilliant." I felt heat rise in my cheeks, flattered that he'd not only noticed my work, but remembered my name. "Thank you. I've read your law review articles. Your piece on prosecutorial discretion was really insightful." "You actually read that?" Adrian's laugh was warm, surprised, genuine. "Most people just pretend to engage with law review content to network. You're different, aren't you?" Different. The word hit me like validation I didn't know I'd been craving. In a room full of perfectly polished law students who'd grown up in this world, Adrian Blackwell, editor of the Law Review, already secured for partnership track at Whitman and Associates, thought I was different. "I hope that's a good thing," I said, attempting the kind of playful flirtation that seemed to come naturally to other women. "It's the best thing." Adrian moved closer, close enough that I could smell his expensive cologne mixed with something uniquely him. "Victoria, can I tell you something? I've been watching you all semester, trying to work up the courage to talk to you." "You? Nervous about talking to someone?" I couldn't hide my disbelief. Adrian Blackwell was law school royalty, the kind of person who commanded attention just by existing. "You intimidate me," he said, his voice dropping to something more intimate. "Your intelligence, your focus, the way you see straight through all the pretense that everyone else gets lost in. You see the real me, don't you?" The real me. As if I possessed some special insight that others lacked, some unique ability to perceive his authentic self beneath the polished exterior. I felt chosen in a way that made my entire body hum with purpose. "I think I do," I whispered, and Adrian's smile was blinding. The next 3 months were the most intoxicating of my life. Adrian pursued me with the focused intensity of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted, but he made it feel like worship rather than conquest. He sent flowers to my dorm with notes that referenced obscure legal cases we'd discussed. He took me to restaurants I'd only read about in magazines, wine bars where the bottles cost more than my textbooks, galleries where he'd explain the significance of paintings with the casual expertise of someone raised in cultural sophistication. "You're so different from other women I've dated," he'd say during our long dinners, reaching across the table to touch my hand. "They were all so predictable, interested in my family's money, my connections, what I could do for their careers. But you actually care about ideas, about justice, about making the world better." I bloomed under his attention like a flower that had been living in shadow. Adrian made me feel brilliant, beautiful, significant in ways I'd never experienced. When he looked at me, I saw myself reflected in his eyes as someone worthy of devotion, someone special enough to capture the heart of Columbia, law school's golden boy. But even in those early months, there were moments when Adrian's mask slipped just enough for me to glimpse something calculating underneath. The way he'd ask seemingly casual questions about my childhood, my insecurities, my deepest fears. How he'd remember every vulnerability I shared and somehow work it into future conversations. Not obviously, but subtly enough that I felt understood rather than studied. "Tell me about your father," he said one evening as we lay in his apartment, my head on his chest, feeling more content than I'd ever felt in my life. "There's not much to tell. He left when I was 12. I haven't seen him since." The words came out easier than they ever had before, maybe because Adrian's fingers stroking my hair made me feel safe enough to be vulnerable. "That must have been devastating for a little girl," Adrian said, his voice full of sympathy. "No wonder you're so strong, so independent. You learned early that you can only count on yourself." I felt tears prick my eyes at his understanding, at the way he'd perfectly articulated something I'd never been able to express. Sometimes I wonder if it was something I did. If I'd been a better daughter, maybe he would have stayed. "Victoria, look at me." Adrian's voice was firm, compelling. When I met his eyes, they were full of fierce protectiveness. "Your father leaving had nothing to do with you. You were a child. He was a coward who couldn't handle the responsibility of loving someone as extraordinary as you." The words wrapped around my wounded heart like healing balm. Adrian saw my abandonment wound not as evidence of my unworthiness, but as proof of my strength. In his eyes, my father's leaving wasn't a rejection. It was his failure to recognize what he was losing. But what I didn't understand then was that Adrian wasn't healing my wound. He was mapping it. Every vulnerability I shared, every insecurity I revealed, every fear I confessed was carefully cataloged for future use. He was learning exactly which buttons to push to make me grateful for his love, desperate to keep his approval, willing to reshape myself to maintain his interest. My grades began to slip as I prioritized our relationship over my studies. When Adrian called needing emotional support after a difficult day at his internship, I'd abandon my research to listen to him process his stress. When he suggested we spend study time together, I'd find myself so focused on his presence that I absorbed nothing from my casebooks. "You're glowing," my study partner Jessica observed one afternoon when I arrived 20 minutes late to our constitutional law review session, still buzzed from Adrian's lunch hour attention. "This thing with Adrian Blackwell is really working for you." But even Jessica's approval came with a note of concern. "Just don't lose yourself in it, okay? You worked too hard to get here to let anyone, even someone as amazing as Adrian, derail your goals." I laughed. Off her concern, convinced that love and ambition could coexist perfectly. I didn't recognize that Adrian was already rewriting my priorities, that his needs were gradually becoming more important than my own aspirations. I was becoming his perfect mirror, reflecting back whatever version of myself would keep his attention focused on me. The first crack in the perfect facade came 3 months into our relationship, so subtle I almost missed it. We were at dinner celebrating Adrian's acceptance to the New York bar, and I was wearing a dress I'd saved for months to buy. Red silk that made me feel confident and beautiful. "You look gorgeous tonight," Adrian said as we were seated, but there was something off in his tone. "Though red might not be your color, it's a bit loud. You're more beautiful when you let your natural elegance speak for itself." The comment stung in a way I couldn't quite articulate. He'd complimented and criticized me simultaneously, leaving me uncertain whether I should feel flattered or hurt. I found myself tugging at the dress hem for the rest of the evening, suddenly self-conscious about a color that had made me feel radiant just hours earlier. "I thought you liked this dress," I said carefully as we walked back to his apartment. "I love everything about you, Victoria. I just think you're too sophisticated for flashy colors. You don't need to try so hard to get attention. You're naturally captivating." Again, the compliment wrapped around a criticism, making me feel simultaneously cherished and corrected. I began to notice this pattern in other conversations. The way Adrian would praise my intelligence while suggesting I was overthinking things, admire my independence while implying I was too rigid, celebrate my authenticity while hinting that certain aspects of my personality were off-putting. I started adjusting myself in small ways, dimming the parts of my personality that seemed to displease him, amplifying the qualities that earned his approval. I became fluent in the language of his preferences, monitoring his reactions to everything from my clothing choices to my opinions on legal theory. I thought being chosen by someone magnificent would heal the wound of being abandoned by someone ordinary. Instead, I was learning to abandon myself in increasingly sophisticated ways, trading pieces of my authentic identity for the security of his continued attention. But I told myself this was love, this careful choreography of pleasing someone whose approval felt like sunlight after a lifetime of shadow. I didn't yet understand that I was becoming Adrian's perfect mirror, reflecting back exactly what he needed to see while slowly disappearing into his reflection. The shift from paradise to purgatory happened so gradually that I convinced myself I was imagining it. Adrian's constant attention became sporadic, his daily calls reduced to whenever he felt like talking, his elaborate romantic gestures replaced by the assumption that I'd be available whenever he decided to grace me with his presence. "Sorry I didn't call last night," he'd say casually, not really sounding sorry at all. "I got caught up with work stuff. You understand, right?" I always said I understood, even when his Instagram stories showed him at dinner with law school friends, at networking events where he'd post photos with other women whose smiles seemed brighter than mine had been lately. I understood because the alternative, questioning him, had become a minefield where any misstep could trigger one of his silent treatments. The silent treatments were psychological warfare disguised as emotional unavailability. Adrian would withdraw completely. No calls, no texts, no acknowledgement of my existence, leaving me desperately analyzing our last conversation for whatever transgression had earned his disapproval. I'd replay every word I'd said, every expression on my face, searching for the moment I'd failed to be what he needed me to be. I became fluent in the language of his moods while forgetting how to speak my own truth. Every eggshell I walked on was a piece of my authentic self I crushed underfoot. "Adrian, did I do something wrong?" I asked during one of our infrequent dinners, after he'd spent the entire meal checking his phone and offering only monosyllabic responses to my attempts at conversation. "Why would you think that?" His tone was carefully neutral, but there was something cold in his eyes that made my stomach clench with anxiety. "You seem distant lately, like you're upset with me about something, but I don't know what." I hated how small my voice sounded, how desperately I was seeking his reassurance. Adrian set down his fork and looked at me with the kind of patient expression you'd give a child having an irrational tantrum. "Victoria, not everything is about you. I'm under enormous pressure at work, dealing with family issues, managing 1,000 different responsibilities. The fact that you're making my stress about our relationship is honestly pretty selfish." The words hit like a slap. I felt my cheeks burn with shame at being called selfish, at having my legitimate concerns reframed as self-centered neediness. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make your stress worse. I just..." I miss how close we used to be. We're still close, Adrian said, his voice softening just enough to offer hope. I'm just going through a difficult period. If you could be patient with me instead of adding to my pressure, that would really help. I nodded eagerly, grateful for this explanation that made my confusion make sense. Adrian wasn't pulling away. He was dealing with legitimate stress, and my job as his girlfriend was to support him, not burden him with my insecurities. But the relief was temporary. Adrian's difficult period stretched into months, punctuated by moments of renewed attention that felt like water in a desert. He'd appear at my dorm with flowers and apologies, sweep me into elaborate romantic gestures that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with him, then disappear again into his world of work stress and family obligations. The gaslighting was so subtle I didn't recognize it as manipulation. Adrian would deny conversations we'd had, dismiss promises he'd made, and rewrite our shared history with such confidence that I began to question my own memory. You said you'd come to my moot court competition, I reminded him when he failed to show up for the most important academic event of my semester. I never said that, Victoria. I told you I'd try to make it if my schedule allowed, but I specifically said not to count on it because of my caseload. His voice carried that patient tone again, the one that made me feel like I was misremembering basic facts about my own life. But I specifically remember. You remember what you wanted to hear, not what I actually said. This is becoming a pattern with you, honestly. You create these expectations in your head and then get upset when reality doesn't match your fantasy. I stared at him, feeling my grip on reality wobble. Had I misunderstood? Had I really created expectations that he'd never actually set? Adrian seemed so certain, so calm in his recollection, while I felt confused and emotional, exactly the kind of state that made reliable memory impossible. Maybe you're right, I said quietly, hating myself for doubting my own perceptions but unable to trust them when they conflicted with his certainty. The triangulation began with his ex-girlfriend, Sarah, who still had his number and apparently felt comfortable texting him about work emergencies at all hours. When I questioned the appropriateness of their ongoing communication, Adrian's response was swift and devastating. Sarah and I work at competing firms. Of course, we discuss cases and industry developments. The fact that you're jealous of professional communication shows how insecure you've become. He shook his head with disappointment. I used to admire your confidence, Victoria. This possessive behavior is really unattractive. Unattractive. The word lodged in my chest like a shard of glass. Adrian used to call me beautiful, captivating, extraordinary. Now I was unattractive because I'd expressed discomfort with his ex-girlfriend's constant presence in our relationship. But Sarah was just the beginning. Adrian began mentioning other women with just enough admiration to make me feel replaceable. Colleagues whose insights impressed him, classmates whose intelligence he respected, even strangers he'd meet at networking events who possessed qualities I apparently lacked. Jennifer from my securities law seminar has such an interesting perspective on regulatory frameworks, he'd say during dinner, his eyes lighting up in a way they rarely did when discussing my achievements. She's brilliant and so articulate. You'd probably like her. I wouldn't like her, and we both knew it. Jennifer represented everything I was failing to be. Fascinating enough to capture Adrian's intellectual attention, articulate enough to hold his interest, brilliant enough to earn his respect. I felt myself shrinking in comparison to these other women who seemed to effortlessly possess the qualities that Adrian valued. The restaurant incident crystallized everything I'd been trying not to see. We were at Café Nouveau, the upscale bistro where Adrian had first told me he loved me, celebrating his acceptance to the New York Bar Association. I'd worn a black dress that used to make him call me stunning, spent an hour on my hair and makeup, prepared conversation topics about his achievement. But from the moment we sat down, Adrian's attention was focused on everyone except me. He flirted with our waitress, a beautiful blonde who couldn't have been older than 22, complimenting her earrings, asking about her studies, treating her with the kind of focused charm he used to reserve for me. "Your girlfriend is so lucky," the waitress said with a smile that felt like pity. "You two make such a beautiful couple." "Thank you." Adrian replied, but he didn't look at me when he said it. I sat across from him feeling invisible, watching the man I loved perform the same seduction routine that had once made me feel special, realizing that I'd never been unique, just the current recipient of attention he could withdraw and redirect at will. "Why did you flirt with her?" I asked as we walked home, my voice carefully controlled to avoid sounding like the jealous girlfriend he'd been training me not to be. "Flirt with who? The waitress?" "Victoria, I was being polite. Just because I'm pleasant to service workers doesn't mean I'm flirting. Your paranoia is getting really concerning." Paranoia. Another word to add to my growing collection of character flaws. Selfish, insecure, possessive, unattractive, paranoid. I was becoming someone I didn't recognize, someone whose perceptions couldn't be trusted, someone whose emotional reactions were evidence of psychological instability rather than reasonable responses to troubling behavior. My friends began expressing concern about the changes they were seeing in me. Jessica cornered me after a study group session where I'd been distracted and anxious, constantly checking my phone for messages from Adrian that never came. "Victoria, are you okay? You seem different lately. Stressed in a way that's not about school." Jessica's voice was gentle but worried. "Is everything all right with Adrian?" "Everything's fine," I said automatically, the response I'd practiced for weeks. "He's just under a lot of pressure at work, and I'm trying to be supportive." Supportive is good, but you shouldn't have to disappear to support someone else. You've missed 3 girls' nights, you barely participate in study groups anymore, and you look exhausted all the time. Jessica paused, choosing her words carefully. "Healthy relationships don't require you to become someone else." But I was someone else. Someone who monitored Adrian's moods like a meteorologist tracking dangerous weather. Someone who adjusted her personality based on his feedback. Someone who'd learned to question her own perceptions when they conflicted with his version of reality. I was his perfect mirror, reflecting back whatever he needed to see while slowly erasing everything that made me who I used to be. The cycle became predictable. Adrian would withdraw, leaving me desperate to understand what I'd done wrong. I'd analyze every interaction, modify my behavior, become more accommodating and less demanding. Just when I reached my breaking point, he'd return with expensive gifts and elaborate apologies that made me feel guilty for doubting him. "I'm sorry I've been distant," he'd say, presenting me with jewelry that cost more than my monthly expenses. "Work has been insane, and I've been taking my stress out on the person I love most. Forgive me?" How could I not forgive him when he looked at me with those storm cloud eyes full of what seemed like genuine remorse? When he held me close and whispered about how much he needed me, how I was the only person who understood him, how lost he'd be without my patience and support. But the apologies became shorter, the gifts more impersonal, and the periods of withdrawal longer and more punishing. I was walking on eggshells that grew thinner with each passing day, terrified that any misstep would shatter whatever remained of his love for me. I became fluent in the language of his moods while forgetting how to speak my own truth. Every eggshell I walked on was a piece of my authentic self I crushed underfoot, sacrificed to maintain the illusion that if I could just be perfect enough, patient enough, understanding enough, Adrian would love me the way he had in the beginning. I didn't yet understand that the beginning had been a performance, that his love had always been conditional, and that no amount of self-erasure would ever be enough to earn the unconditional acceptance I was desperately seeking. I was becoming exactly what Adrian needed me to be, a reflection of his desires with no independent identity to complicate his control. The perfect mirror was learning to crack, but I mistook the fissures for flaws in myself, rather than breaks in his carefully constructed illusion. The first time I tried to leave Adrian, it was after a week that broke something fundamental inside me. He'd ignored me for 5 days straight, refused to answer my calls, then shown up at my dorm at midnight expecting sex like nothing had happened. When I asked where he'd been, he looked at me with such contempt that I felt my soul shrivel. "I was handling adult responsibilities, Victoria. Not everyone has the luxury of obsessing over relationship drama." His voice was ice cold, clinical in its dismissal. "Your neediness is becoming a real problem." I stared at him standing in my doorway, this man who'd once called me the love of his life, and finally saw him clearly. The mask had slipped completely, revealing something cruel and calculating underneath. I felt 24 years of people-pleasing crack open, and for the first time in months, I found my voice. Get out. What did you say? Adrian's expression shifted from contempt to shock. Apparently, I'd never said no to him before. I said, "Get out. We're done. I can't do this anymore." My hands were shaking, but my voice was steady. "I won't be treated like I'm disposable." Adrian's face went through a series of micro-expressions, surprise, calculation, then something that looked almost like panic. "Victoria, you're being dramatic. You know I'm under stress. Don't make decisions when you're emotional." "I'm not being dramatic. I'm being clear. This relationship is destroying me, and I'm ending it." That's when Adrian deployed his first weapon of mass emotional destruction. "If you leave me, I don't know what I'll do to myself." His voice broke, tears appearing in his eyes with startling suddenness. "You're the only good thing in my life, Victoria. Without you, I have nothing to live for." The words hit me like a physical blow. This was Adrian Blackwell, law review editor, future corporate lawyer, golden boy of Columbia Law, threatening suicide if I left him. The power dynamic shifted instantly from my moment of strength to his desperate vulnerability. "Adrian, you don't mean that." But even as I said it, I was already moving toward him, my anger dissolving into terror at the thought of being responsible for his death. "I do mean it. You're the only person who's ever really loved me, who's ever seen past the surface to who I really am." He reached for my hands, his own trembling with what seemed like genuine desperation. "I know I've been difficult lately, but I can change. I'll get therapy. I'll do whatever it takes. Just please don't abandon me." The word abandon triggered every insecurity I'd carried since childhood. My father had abandoned me. Now I was about to abandon Adrian. The paralysis was immediate and complete. I couldn't become the kind of person who left someone when they needed help most. I kept returning to my prison because my jailer had convinced me that my freedom would destroy us both. Love became indistinguishable from captivity, and escape felt like betrayal. "Okay," I whispered, hating myself for the relief I felt at avoiding the responsibility of his potential suicide. "Okay, we can work on this." The honeymoon period that followed was intoxicating in its intensity. Adrian became the man I'd fallen in love with, attentive, romantic, full of promises about couples therapy and better communication. He took me to dinner at the restaurant where we'd had our first date, bought me the expensive perfume I'd admired months earlier, spent entire weekends focused solely on rebuilding our connection. I almost lost the most important thing in my life because I was too proud to admit I needed help, he said during one of our reconciliation dinners. "You saved me, Victoria. Your willingness to fight for us when I'd given up on myself. That's real love." For 3 weeks, I believed we'd broken through to something authentic. Adrian seemed genuinely committed to change, more emotionally available than he'd been in months, grateful for my forgiveness in ways that made me feel valuable and necessary. Then the cycle began again. The second time I tried to leave, Adrian's tactics were more sophisticated. Along with the suicide threats, he added promises of immediate therapy, detailed explanations of his childhood trauma, and elaborate plans for our future together. He'd researched relationship counselors, scheduled appointments, even bought self-help books about emotional unavailability. "I've been reading about attachment disorders," he said, showing me highlighted passages about abandonment fears and trust issues. I think my father's emotional abuse affected me more than I realized. But now that I understand the pattern, I can change it. We can heal this together. The third time, he added financial manipulation. "If you leave, I'll have to drop out of my summer associate program. I can't function without your emotional support, and if I lose this opportunity, my entire career trajectory is ruined. Is that really what you want? To destroy everything I've worked for?" By the fourth attempt, Adrian had learned to weaponize my vulnerabilities with surgical precision. "You're just like your father, aren't you? When things get difficult, you run." I thought you were different, Victoria. I thought you understood what commitment meant. Each time I tried to leave, Adrian's hoovering tactics became more sophisticated, his emotional manipulation more targeted, his promises more elaborate. He learned exactly which buttons to push to make me feel guilty for prioritizing my own well-being over his mental health. My friends began to lose patience with the on-again, off-again drama. Jessica stopped answering my calls when I needed to process the latest reconciliation. Sarah from my study group avoided me entirely after I'd canceled plans for the third time to manage Adrian's latest crisis. Victoria, I can't keep doing this, Jessica finally said during one of our brief conversations. Every few months, you call me crying about how terrible Adrian is, how you're finally done with him, how you're going to focus on yourself. Then 2 weeks later, you're back together and making excuses for his behavior. I love you, but I can't be your emotional support system for a relationship you refuse to actually leave. The isolation was devastating but predictable. Adrian had successfully trained me to prioritize his needs over all my other relationships, and now those relationships were crumbling under the weight of my inability to make permanent changes. It was during the sixth cycle that I finally started seeing Dr. Patricia Morrison, a therapist who specialized in relationship trauma. Our sessions began to give me language for what I was experiencing, frameworks for understanding the patterns that had become my normal. What you're describing sounds like a trauma bond, Dr. Morrison explained during our fourth session. The cycle of intermittent reinforcement, punishment followed by reward, creates an addictive dynamic that's incredibly difficult to break. But Adrian says he loves me. When we reconcile, it feels real. The connection, the intimacy, it's everything I've ever wanted in a relationship. Abusers don't maintain control through constant cruelty, Victoria. They maintain it through the promise that the good times will return if you just try harder, sacrifice more, be more understanding. Dr. Morrison's voice was gentle but firm. The question isn't whether Adrian is capable of love. The question is whether what he's offering you meets your definition of healthy love. The seventh attempt to leave was different because I'd spent months in therapy learning to recognize my own patterns. When Adrian deployed his usual arsenal of suicide threats and childhood trauma explanations, I felt something shift inside me, not the familiar guilt and panic, but a cold recognition of the manipulation tactics I'd studied in our sessions. Adrian, I think you should call the suicide prevention hotline if you're having thoughts of self-harm. I can give you the number. I don't need a hotline, Victoria. I need you. You're the only person who can help me through this. That's not true, and it's not fair to make me responsible for your mental health. If you're genuinely suicidal, you need professional help, not a romantic relationship. For the first time, my response didn't include promises to stay, desperate attempts to fix his pain, or acceptance of responsibility for his emotional regulation. Adrian's mask slipped again, revealing irritation that his usual tactics weren't working. Fine, he said, his voice shifting from broken vulnerability to cold anger. If you want to be selfish, that's your choice, but don't come crawling back when you realize what you've lost. The 8th time I tried to leave, I didn't tell him I was leaving. I'd spent months planning my exit strategy with Dr. Morrison's help. I changed my phone number, blocked Adrian on all social media platforms, and arranged to spend my final semester studying abroad in London through Columbia's exchange program. I told only a few trusted professors about my plans, keeping the details deliberately vague. But Adrian discovered my escape plan 3 days before my departure. He appeared at my dorm at 2 a.m., his face contorted with rage I'd never seen before. You think you can just disappear? After everything I've done for you, everything I've sacrificed for this relationship? His voice was pure venom, all pretense of vulnerability abandoned. You're making the biggest mistake of your life, Victoria. Adrian, how did you get into the building? The security guard should have prevented him from accessing the dorms after midnight. I have connections you can't even imagine. Friends in places you'll never reach. You want to run away to London like a coward? Fine. But don't think distance will protect you from the consequences of betraying me. The threat was clear, even if the specifics were vague. Adrian wasn't just angry about losing control over me. He was promising retaliation for my escape. For the first time, I saw him not as a wounded man in need of healing, but as a predator whose prey was getting away. "I'm not betraying you, Adrian. I'm choosing myself." "Same thing," he said, his smile cold and promising violence I couldn't yet imagine. "I hope London is worth it, Victoria. I really do." I kept returning to my prison because my jailer had convinced me that my freedom would destroy us both. But sitting in my dorm room at 3 a.m., watching Adrian finally reveal his true nature, I realized that my captivity was destroying me slowly, while my freedom would only destroy his control. The hostage situation was ending, but the real war was just beginning. The call from Columbia's Office of Academic Affairs came on a Tuesday morning in February, 3 weeks after I'd settled into my flat in South Kensington. I was making tea in my tiny kitchen, finally beginning to feel like I could breathe without monitoring someone else's mood when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. "Miss Sterling, this is Dean Richardson's office at Columbia Law School. We need to discuss some serious allegations that have been brought to our attention regarding your senior thesis." The words hit me like ice water. "I'm sorry, what allegations?" "We've received reports suggesting possible plagiarism in your constitutional law research. Anonymous sources have provided evidence that portions of your work may have been improperly sourced or fabricated. I'm afraid we'll need to conduct a full investigation." My hand started shaking so violently I nearly dropped the phone. "That's impossible. Every source in my thesis is properly cited. I have all my research notes, my drafts, everything documented." "I understand this is distressing, Miss Sterling. However, the allegations are quite detailed and include specific passages that allegedly match unpublished academic work. We'll need you to return to New York immediately to participate in the investigation process." The line went dead, and I stood in my London kitchen feeling the ground dissolve beneath my feet. 8,000 miles away, Adrian Blackwell was reaching across an ocean to destroy me with the same systematic precision he'd used to control me for 3 years. But this time, his retaliation had given me exactly what I needed to see the full scope of his predatory behavior. The investigation lasted 4 months and nearly destroyed what remained of my sanity. I flew back to New York every few weeks to meet with academic review boards, provide documentation for my research process, and watch my carefully built reputation crumble under the weight of anonymous accusations. My law firm offer was rescinded, my graduation delayed indefinitely, and my academic record marked with an ethics investigation that would follow me for years. The good news is that we can't find any evidence to support the plagiarism allegations, Dean Richardson told me during our final meeting. "Your documentation is thorough, your sources are properly cited, and the supposedly matching passages don't actually exist in any published work we can locate." "Then why did this investigation take 4 months?" "Because the initial reports were very convincing, Miss Sterling. Someone with detailed knowledge of your research methodology and academic writing style provided what appeared to be credible evidence of misconduct. The fact that this evidence ultimately proved fabricated suggests that someone with intimate access to your work orchestrated these accusations. Someone with intimate access to my work. Someone who'd spent 3 years cataloging my vulnerabilities, learning my patterns, studying my weaknesses. Someone who knew exactly how to weaponize institutional systems against me, but while Adrian was busy destroying my immediate future, he'd made a crucial mistake. He'd revealed his pattern of post-breakup retaliation. And patterns can be researched, documented, and exposed. I spent the next 6 months in a legal research fugue state, using every database access tool Columbia provided to investigate defamation law, academic harassment, and systematic reputation destruction. What I found was devastating in its implications and liberating in its clarity. Rebecca Chen wasn't difficult to find once I knew to look for her. She'd graduated from Columbia's psychology doctoral program 2 years before I arrived, but her academic trajectory had been derailed by anonymous reports about substance abuse and unprofessional behavior. The accusations had been thoroughly investigated and ultimately disproven, but not before she'd lost her research funding and been forced to withdraw from the program. She was now practicing as a trauma therapist in Boston, specializing in recovery from psychological abuse and manipulation. Our first phone conversation was cautious. She was understandably suspicious of contact from someone connected to her past trauma. But when I described the plagiarism investigation and mentioned Adrian's name, her response was immediate and devastating. Adrian Blackwell. I wondered when someone would finally connect the dots. Rebecca's voice was steady, professional, but I could hear years of suppressed anger underneath the clinical tone. He did the same thing to me, Victoria. Anonymous reports to my dissertation advisor about missed meetings, concerns about my mental health, allegations that I was misusing research data. By the time I proved the accusations were false, I'd lost my place in the program, and my advisor's confidence. How did you know it was him? Because the reports contained details about my research methodology that only someone with intimate knowledge of my work could have known. Adrian and I dated for 2 years during my final doctoral phases. He was the only person outside my committee who understood my project well enough to fabricate convincing academic misconduct allegations. Sarah Mitchell was harder to locate, but persistence and law school networking connections eventually led me to her current position at a nonprofit legal aid organization in Philadelphia. Her story was devastatingly similar. Anonymous reports to potential employers about emotional instability and unprofessional behavior, carefully timed to coincide with major career opportunities. I lost a federal clerkship because someone contacted the judge's office with concerns about my psychological fitness, Sarah told me during our first phone call. The information was detailed enough to seem credible. Specific incidents, dates, even quotes from conversations I'd supposedly had about being unable to handle stress. How did you know the information was fabricated? Because the incidents they described never happened, but they were close enough to real situations to seem plausible. Someone had taken genuine conversations and twisted them into evidence of mental illness. Adrian was the only person who knew me well enough to create such convincing lies. The three of us began meeting regularly via video calls, comparing notes and documenting patterns with the methodical precision of building a legal case. What we discovered was a systematic campaign of post-breakup destruction that Adrian had been perpetrating for years, using his law school connections and understanding of institutional processes to weaponize administrative systems against his former victims. He doesn't just abuse women during relationships, Rebecca observed during one of our sessions. He destroys them afterward to prevent them from exposing his behavior or interfering with future relationships. It's not emotional. It's strategic, and it works because the accusations are always anonymous, always plausible enough to trigger investigations, and always timed to maximum damage potential, Sarah added. By the time we prove our innocence, our reputations and opportunities are already destroyed. But understanding Adrian's pattern also revealed his vulnerability. He operated in elite professional circles where reputation mattered more than truth, where whisper campaigns could destroy careers faster than legal proceedings. But those same circles valued expertise, authenticity, and professional credibility, qualities that victims of systematic abuse often developed in abundance. That's when I decided to become something Adrian had never encountered before, a victim who understood his psychology well enough to predict and counter his strategies. I started small, creating an anonymous blog called The Predator's Playbook that documented patterns of psychological manipulation in professional environments without naming specific individuals. The blog gained modest traction among survivors of workplace harassment and academic abuse, but it wasn't until I began sharing specific tactics, love-bombing techniques, triangulation strategies, gaslighting methods, post-breakup retaliation patterns, that readership began to grow significantly. The hoovering cycle. How emotional predators recapture escaped victims became my most read post, generating hundreds of comments from people who recognized their own experiences in my anonymous descriptions. Weaponizing institutional systems, when abusers use official channels for retaliation, sparked conversations among academic and legal professionals about the vulnerability of reputation-based career fields to systematic sabotage. Adrian's reaction was swift and predictable. Within weeks of the blog's launch, I received calls from remaining Columbia contacts warning me about concerning reports regarding my online activities and their potential impact on the law school's reputation. He was deploying the same whisper campaign tactics he'd perfected, but this time I was ready for him. Sarah had become an employment lawyer specializing in workplace harassment cases, and she helped me establish legal protections for the blog's content and my identity as its author. Rebecca provided therapeutic frameworks for the posts, ensuring that my writing served survivors rather than simply seeking revenge against Adrian. "What you're doing is powerful, Victoria," Rebecca told me during one of our video calls. "You're giving people language for experiences they couldn't articulate, frameworks for understanding manipulation they couldn't identify. This isn't just about Adrian anymore. It's about every predator who uses these tactics." But it was still about Adrian, at least partially. Every post I wrote was informed by 3 years of psychological warfare. Every pattern I documented had been tested on my own trauma. Every manipulation technique I exposed had been used to systematically destroy my sense of reality. The moment I realized I wasn't his only victim, my shame transformed into strategy. My isolation became alliance, and my silence became the foundation for exposing his entire system of control. The blog continued to grow, attracting attention from journalists covering workplace harassment, researchers studying psychological manipulation, and most importantly, survivors who were finally finding words for experiences they'd been unable to describe. Adrian had created the perfect teacher for recognizing and exposing narcissistic abuse. A victim who'd survived his complete arsenal of psychological weapons and emerged with the analytical skills to document exactly how that arsenal worked. His mirror had shattered, but the fragments were reflecting light in directions he'd never anticipated. Every piece of me he'd broken was becoming a weapon in someone else's liberation. The reckoning had begun, and Adrian Blackwell was about to learn what happened when your victims refused to stay silent. The call came 18 months after The Predator's Playbook had become required reading in graduate courses on workplace harassment. Sarah answered her office phone on a Friday afternoon, expecting another routine consultation about employment discrimination, and instead heard a voice that made her immediately reach for her recording equipment. "Ms. Mitchell, my name is Jennifer Walsh. I'm a second-year associate at Whitman and Associates, and I need legal advice about what I can only describe as systematic psychological harassment from a senior colleague." Sarah's blood went cold. Whitman and Associates was Adrian's firm, and the behavioral patterns Jennifer described over the next 45 minutes were devastatingly familiar. Love bombing followed by devaluation, triangulation with other women in the office, professional sabotage when she tried to transfer departments, and a campaign of reputation destruction when she'd attempted to document the abuse. "He made me feel like I was losing my mind," Jennifer said, her voice shaking with recognition of her own experience. "One day I'm his brilliant protege, the next day I'm too emotional for high-stakes litigation. He'd praise my work in private, then undermine me in meetings. He'd triangulate me with other female associates, making us compete for his approval while he played us against each other." Sarah forwarded me the consultation notes within hours, and I felt something cold and triumphant settle in my chest as I read Jennifer's account. Adrian hadn't changed. He'd simply moved his hunting grounds from law school to his professional practice, targeting younger women who couldn't afford to challenge someone with his seniority and connections. But Jennifer Walsh wasn't a naive law student dependent on his academic recommendations. She was a Harvard Law graduate with documentation skills, legal training, and access to Sarah Mitchell, employment lawyer specializing in workplace harassment cases who understood exactly what she was facing. "We need to be strategic about this," Sarah told Jennifer during their second consultation. "Adrian Blackwell is skilled at making his targets look unstable while presenting himself as the victim of false accusations. But he's never faced someone who documented his behavior from the beginning, and he's never been investigated by people who understand his psychological patterns." Jennifer had been keeping detailed records for months, emails that contradicted Adrian's verbal instructions, witness statements from colleagues who'd observed his triangulation tactics, performance reviews that praised her work despite his claims of her incompetence. When she filed her formal complaint with Whitman's HR department, she had a case file that would have impressed a federal prosecutor. The investigation that followed revealed what we'd suspected for years. Adrian's abuse wasn't limited to romantic relationships. Female colleagues and subordinates dating back to his first year at the firm reported similar patterns of manipulation, professional sabotage, and reputation destruction. The HR department discovered complaints that had been buried, concerns that had been dismissed, and a systematic campaign of psychological warfare disguised as normal workplace dynamics. "The firm can't ignore this level of documented abuse," Sarah told me during one of our regular video calls. Jennifer's complaint opened the floodgates. Women who'd been suffering in silence for years are finally coming forward with their own experiences. Adrian wasn't fired. His connections and legal expertise made termination risky without criminal charges. But he was quietly passed over for partnership, excluded from high-profile cases, and eventually encouraged to seek opportunities elsewhere. His departure was presented as a mutual decision to pursue different career goals, but word traveled quickly through New York's legal community that Adrian Blackwell was a liability who created problems with female colleagues. I completed my delayed law degree that spring and started working for the Coalition for Survivor Justice, a nonprofit organization providing legal services to abuse survivors. My first week on the job, I found an email in my professional inbox that made my hands tremble with rage and something that might have been satisfaction. "Victoria, I hope you're well. I've been following your career with great interest and admiration. The work you're doing at CSJ aligns perfectly with some initiatives my new firm is developing around victim advocacy. I'd love to discuss potential collaboration opportunities. Perhaps we could meet for coffee to explore how our organizations might work together. Best regards, Adrian." The email was masterfully crafted, professional, complimentary, focused on mutual benefit rather than personal reconciliation. But I recognized every manipulation technique he'd deployed, every calculated word designed to re-establish contact and begin the hoovering process again. My response was surgically precise in its professional courtesy and complete emotional unavailability. "Mr. Blackwell, thank you for your inquiry. CSJ's collaboration policies require all potential partnerships to go through our executive director. I've forwarded your email to the appropriate department for their consideration. Best wishes for your continued success." Adrian's subsequent emails became increasingly desperate as he realized that his usual tactics were meeting professional boundaries instead of personal vulnerability. He tried appealing to our shared history, referencing inside jokes from our relationship, mentioning mutual friends who'd asked about me. When none of that worked, he shifted to veiled threats about my blog's impact on his reputation and career prospects. "Victoria, I think we both know that your anonymous writing project has gone too far. While I admire your advocacy work, some of your posts could be interpreted as targeting specific individuals. I hope we can resolve this privately rather than involving legal action." I forwarded his threatening email to Rebecca and Sarah, and we all laughed at his transparent attempt to intimidate me into silence. But Adrian had made a crucial miscalculation, threatening someone with a law degree and connections to employment attorneys who specialized in harassment cases. "He's finally shown his true colors in writing," Sarah observed during our emergency conference call. "This isn't a concerned ex-boyfriend reaching out. This is a predator trying to silence his victim through legal intimidation." Rebecca filed for a restraining order on behalf of all three of us, using years of documented harassment, professional sabotage, and threatening communications as evidence of Adrian's systematic stalking behavior. The order was granted immediately, legally prohibiting Adrian from contacting any of us directly or indirectly, professionally or personally. But the real victory wasn't legal. It was watching Adrian's carefully constructed world contract around him like a shrinking prison. His career trajectory flattened as his reputation for creating problems with female colleagues became industry knowledge. His social circle diminished as former friends grew tired of his constant complaints about being falsely accused by vindictive ex-girlfriends. His ability to access new victims became increasingly limited as women in New York's legal community began sharing warnings about his manipulative behavior. The blog had evolved into something beyond my original vision, a resource center for recognizing and escaping psychological abuse, with detailed explanations of manipulation tactics, practical advice for survivors, and a growing community of people who'd found strength in shared experience. Every month brought new stories from readers who'd recognized their own situations in my anonymous posts, who'd found courage to leave toxic relationships or document workplace harassment. "You created something revolutionary," Rebecca told me during one of our video calls. "You gave people a vocabulary for experiences they couldn't articulate, frameworks for understanding manipulation they couldn't identify. This isn't just about Adrian anymore. It's become a movement." But it was still about Adrian, at least partially. Every manipulation technique I documented had been tested on my own trauma. Every recovery strategy I shared had been earned through my own healing process. Every warning I posted had been written in the blood of my own experience. The last time I saw Adrian was at a coffee shop near Columbia, almost exactly 5 years after he'd first love-bombed me into believing I was special. I was meeting a potential client there, a young lawyer seeking advice about documenting workplace harassment, when I noticed him sitting alone at a corner table. He looked smaller than I remembered, diminished in ways that went beyond physical appearance. His expensive suit couldn't hide the defeat in his posture, the desperation in his eyes as he scrolled through dating apps with the frantic energy of someone whose usual hunting grounds had become toxic to him. He looked up as I passed his table, and for a moment our eyes met. I saw recognition, fear, and something that might have been resignation in his gaze. Adrian Blackwell, former law review editor, failed corporate lawyer, exposed predator, faced with Victoria Sterling. Survivor, advocate, architect of his professional exile. Victoria. He said my name like a prayer, like an apology, like a last desperate attempt to re-establish the connection that had once given his life meaning. I looked at him with the clinical detachment I'd developed through years of therapy and professional training. Adrian. That was it. No emotion, no anger, no residual attraction or fear. Just acknowledgement that we occupied the same space temporarily, two people whose paths had crossed in ways that had fundamentally changed both our lives, though not in the ways he'd intended. I continued to my meeting, leaving him sitting alone with his phone and whatever remained of his delusions about his own superiority. Behind me, I could feel him watching me walk away, not as his victim anymore, but as evidence of everything he'd lost when he'd tried to break someone who refused to stay broken. "You turned me into everything you needed me to be, Adrian. Your mirror, your supply, your hostage. But the most dangerous thing you created was someone who finally understood your playbook well enough to rewrite the ending. And in my version of the story, the predator doesn't get to hunt again. His mirror had shattered completely, but the fragments had reformed into something he'd never anticipated. A woman who'd transformed her deepest trauma into her greatest strength, who'd turned his systematic destruction into systematic exposure, who'd become the reckoning he'd never seen coming. The hostage had become the architect of her captor's exile, and the silence he'd demanded had become the voice that warned others about predators who wore love like a weapon. Adrian Blackwell's hunting days were over, and Victoria Sterling's advocacy work was just beginning. The mirror was broken, but its pieces were reflecting light in all the right directions. Except silent. If Victoria's transformation from Adrian's perfect mirror to his ultimate reckoning gave you chills, hit that subscribe button because recognizing a narcissist's playbook might just save your life or someone you love. Drop a comment below. Have you ever been someone's emotional hostage, walking on eggshells while they rewrote your reality? Your story matters, and this community is here to remind you that breaking free isn't betrayal, it's survival. Strong sparkles.